Christian starting points. I gave several. The first was the Creator. The second was Christ. The third was canon. The fourth was covenant. And I think I only had five. Was creation. Okay. Now, why am I talking about that again here? Because I think when we start talking about the laws of natures, we see what a thing is, and because we can discern what a thing is, we're able to identify it. And when it acts, we're able to understand how it acts. We can understand how it ought to act. In other words, what it is comes embedded with oughtness. Okay? So I used the example last night of my daughter's bladder and kidney, right? You can think about a heart. A bad heart is a heart that doesn't do what? It doesn't pump blood, right? Why? Because that's what a heart is supposed to do. We look at things, we look at organs in our body, and we render a judgment whether or not the organ is good or bad, not merely based on like a statistical anomaly. So we're talking about nature. We're not talking about just what is, as if it's some kind of given, right? So when you ask people like, well, what is something that's natural? And they usually want to talk about something that's been untouched by man, right? The Bambi attitude, man has entered the forest, right? They want to talk about something that's not been touched. They want to talk about things like organic, right? These are usually what we talk about when we think about something that's natural is kind of just left on its own. In that case, like weeds are natural, right? But that's not necessarily what we're trying to get at. Sometimes people say it's just whatever is given, right? And nature gives you all kinds of things. I have my students read an article by a feminist, and she's trying to distinguish between sex and gender and break them apart. And she says sex is about biology, gender is about power, sex is biological, and so it seems rather straightforward. But she said, but sometimes nature gives us things. And then she goes on to list various sexual deformities that are grounded in chromosomal problems, right? So she says sometimes nature's a bit looser, right? But when you look at nature that way, all you're looking at is merely, okay, what's given and what's statistically normal. When we're talking about laws of natures, nothing of what I'm talking about is statistically normal. If there was some weird freak event and everyone ended up with just one arm except for one guy, okay, we wouldn't be like, well, I guess humans just have one arm. Why? Because you look around, most of the humans, what do they have? One arm. We're not talking about that. We're talking about what ought a human to have. They ought to have two arms, right? The example of my daughter having 4 ureters. You don't look at that and go, golly, look at that. Some people just have 4 ureters. I guess that's what humans are like. I guess that's what a good kidney can look like sometimes. No, that's not what it ought to be. So we're not talking about mere statistics. We're talking about what is a thing and what is it ordered to do given its nature, given what it is. Okay? So we look at something like a heart. We know a heart is supposed to pump blood. We look at lungs. We know that they're supposed to help us breathe. We look at the functions of our kidneys, our bladders, our gallbladders, and we know because of what they are, we know what they ought to do, so we can sense when there's a deformity, right? In order for there to be a deformity, there has to be a form that's been deformed, right? In order for you to have a broken vase, you have to have an unbroken vase, right? You say, here's something I had, and then it was broken, right? And we know it's broken because we know what it is, what it was, what it's supposed to be. This is true when we look at things like organs. This is true when we look at things like trees, right? Talk about the tree that grows right at the base, 2 trunks growing in different directions. That's not the way it ought to be. Why? Because that's going to kill the tree. That's not for its well-being. Okay? So, if you view reality, things having natures, which means things having a kind of identity that we're able to distinguish, such as humanness, dogness, anything that's kind of like an adjective like that. Humanness, dogness, treeness, okay? These essences are natures. And we're able to say, okay, these things act, and they act for ends. Therefore, a good tree is a tree that will produce good fruit. Why? Because this is the end, not the end as in like the curtain being drawn, but this is the telos, the purpose of a particular tree. Okay? So the is and the ought are embedded together in the way reality is. So when we talk about laws of nature this way, what we're saying about it is that there's a certain kind of normativity to reality. That reality is ruled and normed, and we can see these rules and norms in the various natures. So that I can look at a tree and say a tree ought to grow up, a dog ought to bark, kidneys ought to function a certain way, a heart ought to function a certain way, and then I can keep going up to say humans ought to function certain ways. This is going back to that idea of metaphysical goodness, but it's rooted in the nature where there is no distinction between what a thing is and what it ought to do. We can look at the nature and say, what are the ends? Eyes ought to see. Why? Because of the principle of sight. When they don't, we say there's a deformity. We wear glasses because we have a privation in our eyes. There's a lack of a good where there ought to be one. So you say, you have bad eyes. Does that mean you look at bad things all day? Well, that's not what we mean when we say that, right? You would say you probably have a bad soul if you're looking at bad things with your eyes all day, right? But if your eyes can look well, they can function in a way that is good, even while looking at things you ought not to look at. And that would be immoral, right? But your eyes are still functioning as good eyes, but your soul is the problem there, okay? So we look at the natures and we see, okay, there's not like this gap between what is and what ought to be. Because when we're able to identify the nature of a thing and understand that it's ordered to certain ends, and insofar as it's ordered to certain ends, we can see what it ought to do. How do we see what it ought to do? Just by virtue of what it is. Most of these options here are seeking to figure out where we can get the ought from. Okay? Why? Because, sadly, most Christians think that you just have a bunch of ises floating around with no normativity, no ends to which a thing is ordered. It doesn't have a telos in anything. So this just is, this particular act over here needs to be done. What's going to supply the gap to say, I ought to do this? Now, a lot of Christians will think, well, I can't look at what anything ought to do unless God tells me that I ought to do it. Okay? Others will say the same thing, unless Christ did it. Unless I can search through the whole Scriptures and see that I ought to do it. Unless I can somehow look to the covenants and see what I ought to do. Okay? Or I have to go back to creation as it originally was. So here's creation back here. And there's a gap because of the way God originally made things and the way things are now. There's no ought. So I have to bring the ought all the way back from the past. Say, well, because God made it this way, then I ought to do this. Instead of saying, no, I can actually look at the way things are right now and see that I ought to do this or ought not to do this. So I don't have to know that in the beginning God created Adam and Eve and say, well, because of Adam and Eve, I give my ought against same-sex marriage. I can look at the nature of humanity and get my ought against same-sex marriage just by looking at what a male is, what a female is, and what the nature of the procreative act is, and the perfecting of completing of our nature, both in families and in societies more broadly, which requires procreation for the propagation and preservation of myself and my species. Therefore, the homosexual act is contrary to nature itself, which is exactly the kind of reason that Paul ends up using in Romans chapter 1. So the question is, well, where do we get our ought from? We get it from the nature that we have. Now, we want to tie these two things together, because what did I say? I said a law is an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has care for the community, and promulgated. Where is the eternal law promulgated? The eternal law is promulgated in the very nature of things. This is why Paul in Romans 2 can talk about it being written on our hearts, even though it's not actually written down on our hearts. Right? Literally speaking. What is written on our hearts? Do good, avoid evil, and those things that necessarily flow from that. With an understanding of good that's rooted in a sound metaphysics, understanding, teleology, and purpose. And we're able to put all those pieces together and say the eternal law of God is published in the very things that he has made, such that we can look at the things that he has made and then move up to the eternal law. Okay, so we're studying the law of God by studying nature. Does that make sense? I feel like I lost people. You can tell me if I lost you. We're good? Okay, I got some thumbs up, so I think we're okay. So the ought is embedded in the very thing itself. When we study the thing itself, we're studying, like, how do I know God designed trees to grow upward? Look at a tree. What's it do? It grows upward. When the tree doesn't do that, it's bad for that thing. Does God decree that some trees don't grow upward? He does. Right? But we don't say, well, because God decreed it, it's good for the tree. No. It fits within his purpose, but it can still be a bad tree. Judas fit within God's purpose and was still an immoral person. Right? Even though God decreed that he would betray our Lord and Savior. Okay? So we don't need to get the ought from these things. We get the ought by looking at our nature, where God has promulgated and published his eternal law. As we study human nature, we're studying the eternal law of God as it has been published in creation, in time, and in space. Okay? As such, natural law is what you would say it's an internal principle of action. Do good and avoid evil. The good is that which after all things seek. Right? And so it's published internal to us, and we pursue that which is good. Now again, we talked about this last night. Sometimes we pursue the apparent good as that which is actually evil. Right? But even when we pursue evil thinking that it is good in some way, shape, or form. Okay? This then is going to differ from these two laws, human and divine. Because these are promulgated externally to us. Where does God write his law? On our hearts. Where? Specifically? In our nature. Where the is and ought can't be separated. Okay? By the way, I keep meaning to make this point. Notice I don't use the language of values. Okay? When you separate is and ought, then you start talking about values. Because you don't think that there's anything that I ought to pursue because of what I is. I know that's not correct grammatically. I'm not trying to speak grammatically all the time. Because of what I is, there's no ought that comes with that. So when I say, I think you ought to do this, or you ought not to do that, I'm not talking about the good. I'm talking about what I value. Right? And so most ethics, you hear like values clarification. Right? You hear people talk about that as they have maybe a business ethics thing. It's merely trying to figure out what is it you prefer. Right? And there's no talk of goodness itself. Okay? Now, that's not to say there isn't a place for value talk. Okay? But we're talking about more than values. Okay? The good is that which is external to us, and we ought to value the good, but sometimes we can value that which is evil. right? But we're not merely just talking about values that are coming from us. There's a real good out there, and that good ought to be valued by us. Sometimes we don't value it, and that's wrong, right? So our values aren't always right. How do we know? Because they don't always correspond to that which is good.
Could you give some examples of where people separate the is and the ought in some ethical issues that we often think are talking about? Just so that. You said last night that there's a number of Christians that separate the is and the ought, like David and David kind of thing. So, like, what are examples that we would recognize?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily like, are there particular examples? It's just, where do you derive the ought from? So, our culture thinks that, like, the Supreme Court ought to give us our oughts. Right? So it gave us our ought on same-sex marriage. You ought to allow it. And so here's an ought that was given, not rooted in nature, but merely human convention and law. And that's usually, so I don't, maybe I'm not understanding your question, or I'm not answering it clearly. Okay. Most people just separate the is and the ought. Like, so it's not like they separate it in particular things. They just don't think that they can be connected. So Christians, because they don't think they can be connected, will then appeal to one of these things to get your ought. So this is where you hear, by what standard? You ever heard that? It's either God's law or man's law, right? Or maybe it's natural. It's natural law, right? But by what standard? Why? Because all we're trying to do is figure out where the ought comes from. But the reason that question is asked is because we don't think we can get an ought from what things are. So I don't know that it's necessarily like any particular kind of thing. So why shouldn't I marry a member of the same sex? Well, we could say, well, the law of the land says you can't. Well, our law of the land doesn't say that anymore, right? Well, because of Leviticus. And like, yes, Leviticus does teach that, but that's divine law externally promulgated to us, right? But that divine law, which I'll get to, that's externally promulgated to us, is just written on our hearts and in our nature. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Go ahead.
So, which would be why, like you said last night, the African tribe. And I met someone from Africa a number of months ago, and they said, over there, Christian or no Christian, you'll get beat up for that. Like, it's just not accepted.
Yeah.
And because it's clearly recognized.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give an explanation again of what is the good?
Yeah. The good, and if we're talking about the good, it's that which is the object of appetite.
The object of appetite.
Like, so something that pulls us in, that we ought to come into. So
good appetite, though, right? Because you could have a bad appetite.
But even if you have a bad appetite, you're still pursuing that which you think is good.
So
but you're not pursuing the real good. It's just that what you perceive to be good.
So say that again. The good is the draw of your appetite.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. The good is what?
Good is the draw of your appetite.
Yeah. So when we talk about the good, we're chiefly talking about that which our action is ordered to. And we only act because we have an appetite that we see being satisfied by good. The question then, is it a real good or is it a perceived good? How do we know that? By looking at what a particular nature is. Looking at the particular thing in question. And is it acting in accordance to its proper ends and able to bring that about?
I don't know if it'd be serviceable at this point in relating eternal and natural, but the theological reality of participation. That whether we're talking about a good dog,
yeah,
or
yeah,
a good tree,
yeah,
it's because they all in some way are participating by creation in God.
Yeah,
and so that's ordering.
Yeah,
what is good in any given particular nature.
Yeah. So I would say first they're participating in the life of God. which gives us being. And being then is good. There's no goodness without being. Being kind of serves as a ground for goodness, but all being is goodness. So first it's participating in the life of God, then it's participating in the goodness of God. Sometimes people get icky with participation language. I'm assuming that's not the case here because you brought it up. But what other goodness and what other life are you participating in? There is no other goodness out there. There is no other life out there. So God, who life from himself, right? We receive it. We're beneficiaries of that. We receive life and goodness from God, which then the really fun thing is to say that means even Satan is good, right? Satan has some kind of goodness because what is evil? It's a privation, which is a lack of good. But in order for there to be a lack of good, that comes back to like you can't just have a hole hanging out here. Satan has being. He has life. Life is good. Now, he's perverted it. He's twisted it, right? But as long as Satan has being, which he will always have, then there's something that we can say about Satan insofar as because he has being, he is good. Because being is good. Is there another? I feel like there's another. Lord.
I was just going to say, as I'm thinking about this, like for our apologists that are presuppositional, they would have very strong opinions of us starting with the law of nature versus, like you said, the 5 starting points.
Yeah.
But I would say in reality, to start with their 5 starting points is really doing a disservice. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Completely.
Yeah.
You're just not even. Well, they would say this is the foundation to begin on.
Yeah.
It actually is a foundation that leads to a myriad of problems.
Yeah. The sad thing is, and I say this with like, I would, depending on who I was talking to, I would say it in various ways, but like, you don't think God made an intelligible reality.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Mm-hmm.
And that's sad. Mm-hmm. Like when I make something, I assume you know what it's for. Because like I assume I'm not a total moron, and I assume you're not either. I also don't make things.
And to follow up on that then, we would want to hasten to say that when we as Calvinists, as Reformed, as biblical Christians, and we speak of depravity having affected all of our humanity, this total, that doesn't mean that our humanity is lost.
Yeah.
And our ability to be reasonable and to recognize natures was not entirely destroyed by right.
It's total depravity, not extensive and intensive depravity, right? We're saying the whole of man is depraved, but not in such a way that there is nothing to. I mean, he still has some understanding of logic, language, the idea that it's him or her that's still persisting and reading, that their memories rely, like sense perception. Like if you're gonna read a Bible, you have to trust the pagan. And like their senses actually work, and that they're able to look at words, and that words actually have meanings, right? Otherwise, the means of grace don't really serve as a means of anything. Right? They're not means anymore, right? It's just bypassing the mean, like you bypass the ought, and God is just dropping grace totally unrelated to any means.
It's like they're getting rid of the whole ordinance of reason, which is the essence of the law itself.
Mm-hmm.
You're just appealing to the life-starting law.
Yeah. Well, and so that comes back to the comment I made earlier about Doug Wilson, right? And so that theonomic libertarianism. Why? Well, because I can only get my ought from the canon, right? Any other ought that you give me is going to violate my free will. It's going to draw a circle around and tighten on my free will. So saying, no, it's actually to lead you into goodness. That's what it's really for. Yeah. And so all these things definitely do fit together, because that ought is just coming as an ought with power that's being brought down. Now, do I think God is powerful? Absolutely. Do I think God enforces his law? Absolutely. But everything God does is reasonable.
So in apologetics, when you rid yourself of the natural argument, you really do yourself a disservice to people who aren't going to accept what you're saying.
Yeah, and where people will come in and cheat is they'll throw in the only reason that some people get this right is because of common grace. And common grace, then will do this disservice. So almost like everything's been totally eradicated, and sometimes God will sprinkle common grace to kind of elevate someone to be able to miraculously, like a blind squirrel that finds a nut and a broken clock, that's right, twice a day, come to a correct conclusion. And I think that's one of the problems with common grace. Also, this is something I'm interested in, but I haven't done a whole lot of work on. I don't see common grace ever used that way until you get to the 1800s. You don't have our confession speaks of common grace in one place. Anybody know where? Temporary believers. Interesting. It seems to be the only place that I have been able to find it historically in looking at Reformed theologians. And I've not done a wide use, but I kept going. I'm not finding it. And the reason why is because they just believed that man was still a rational animal after the fall, and that the fall didn't eradicate that. It couldn't eradicate that without eradicating the very nature of man himself. Right? And so they didn't need common grace to do this lifting because reality was totally unintelligible. I'm not saying that everyone who uses the language of common grace thinks that reality is totally intelligible. I'm just saying that seems to be what's common in some of these conversations. But yet not what it's been doing historically. Any other questions related to that?
So Romans 1, people on both sides, presuppositional, classical, can acknowledge that there are certain things that nature demonstrates because they have to believe it's in their Bible. But they believe that the unbeliever who sees things from nature is going to just suppress all of that, right? Because they suppress it in unrighteousness. And they read that from the text. So that there's nothing we can gain from nature because our intellect is tied towards sin.
Yeah.
So how do they get that from a fair exposition of the text?
I think there's just this view that the only ever and always thing that these things are doing is damning. They're not actually instructing. And so you have the three uses of the law, right? Reveal God's character and drive us to Christ, and a guide for righteous living for those who are in Christ in the covenant of grace. But the law also restrains evil, right? And so where you forsake transcendent, you often forsake any type of restraint of evil as well. I'm just speaking broadly, natural theology transcendent, right? Not necessarily even the triune God, but when you start to forsake those things, then it becomes, anything goes, right? But insofar as there can be a recognition that these things can be seen and they can be known, there's certain ways in which they can serve as a restraint of evil. And again, that's historically been categorized as one of the uses of the law. Now we talk about common grace as the restraint for evil in the world. And I'm not sure that's the right move. I don't think everybody makes it, but I do. But it's common in the presuppositional camp to make that move because they need something to do that work, and the law can't do it, so grace has to do it. Because the laws on this way, they wouldn't accept any of that, and so grace would have to come in and do the heavy lifting. That makes sense. Okay. So, reality is normative. Prescription is built into the way things are. Okay? That's eternal law, natural law, human law. Okay? Human law has to be measured by natural law. Natural law is the reflection of eternal law. Human law has to be measured by natural law. This and this alone gives you the basis for saying that a man is a tyrant, that a government is a tyrant, or that a government has done something that is wrong. Right? Why? Because they have violated something greater than them that they ought to be able to know and see because it's been promulgated. Right? And what is that? Natural law. Okay? So, human law differs from natural law in several ways. One of the ways that it differs is in the sense that it is promulgated differently, right? It's published differently. The natural law is published on us as a principle for action, as a principle of action. Human law is published to us externally, right? So the government says, do not murder. If you murder, here will be a particular problem that you suffer. Okay? So, human law is published differently. Human law can't prescribe everything that God prescribes. That's what's outside the bounds of it. Its sphere is more limited in terms of what it can prescribe. It's promulgated, it's prescribed differently. And a third thing, I can't find it in my notes right now, and it slipped my mind. Oh, yes. Human law is seeking to make particular determinations about that which is true in natural law, which means that prudence will sometimes lead a nation to change its practices, to more wisely practice natural law in a certain time. It will also lead a different nation to have its practices carried forth in a different way, in a different time. So you can imagine, for example, something like the death penalty, right? You have to agree with the death penalty. But you start to ask, well, how is that enforced? What is the means by which that is carried out? That becomes human law. Taking a particular determination or a particular principle in natural law and then applying that and saying, how is it we're going to do that here? Okay? Is it unnatural for people to drive on the right side of the road versus the left side of the road? In some countries, they drive on one side of the road. In some countries, we drive on the other side of the road. Right? Is one following natural law and the other abandoning natural law? Well, actually, it's just an application of do good, avoid evil. Part of doing good is ordering our lives to the protection and preservation, which means that there should be some kinds of laws that govern and direct how we use these vehicles, which can be dangerous to human life, which means that there's going to have to be some agreed upon and recognized order. In our country, that's on one side of the road, and another country, that's on another side of the road. But they're not contrary to nature. They're both receiving the principles of natural law and saying, how does this work itself out in a particular time and in a particular place? Okay? Human law can sometimes be wrong. Right? The laws of the land can be unjust. By what is that? What should that be measured? Natural law. Now, can we say God has clearly commanded us that we ought not to do this thing? Absolutely. I was at an event recently. One of my state senators was there. And I was going to go speak to him and tell him that our church prays for him monthly. Unfortunately, he left before the event was over, so I didn't get a chance to say something to him. But I would have no problem in my capacity as an officer in Christ Church of quoting a scripture reference to him and saying, this is what God has said. Why? Because I'm acting by that authority, the authority of Jesus Christ, with the authority of Holy Scripture. And I happen to think that this particular state senator would find that very reasonable to him, that I would make that appeal just to what Scripture says directly. But I expect him to govern a little bit differently, right? I expect him, as we've already said, to be using reason, to be using natural law to help implement what our state is supposed to do, right? But he can be wrong. Our governors can be wrong. Our president can be wrong. Our Supreme Court can be wrong, right? The laws that we have in the land and how we enforce them can be wrong. But what is the measure of that? Eternal law. How? Through natural law. You can't just bypass natural law and get to eternal law. We have to come to natural law. So, human law can be wrong. Its measure should be the natural law. Okay? Then there's divine law. Okay? Divine law and human law share some similarities. Divine law is promulgated like human law is promulgated externally. Right? So, God writes His law on our hearts, right? Starting with do good, avoid evil, and all those things that follow from that. But then He also speaks to us and says, do not murder. Right? In the same way that our government officials speak to us and say, do not murder. It's something that's coming from outside of us, not from inside of us, as that which guides and directs our action, but something outside of us that still should guide and direct our action. Right? So it's promulgated like human law is as something that's external to us. It's also different than human law because divine law can never be wrong. It's always good. It's always perfect. Even when it changes. Because sometimes divine law changes. Okay? Human law changes and divine law can sometimes change. Okay? So both can change. One can be right, or one is always right and must be right, because the one who makes it is the one who gives the eternal law. So then, the one who gives the eternal law, or the one who is the eternal law, gives the natural law, gives the divine law, and they come together beautifully as that which is internal and that which is external to us. Okay? Typically, when you start talking about divine law, you talk about it in the tripartite division of the law. You have moral law, ceremonial law, and the judicial law. Okay? The moral law is promulgated differently on Sinai than it is in the natural law to us. Same content, different mode of publishing it. Okay? Some of the things that God gave on Sinai change, right? What changes? The particularization of the day of worship changes, right? So we see some things that are attached to the moral law, right? Insofar as maybe they're tied to covenant, those things disappear and fade away with that particular covenant, right? Such as the promise for long life in the land in the fifth commandment, right? But the things that God has given in the Ten Commandments, insofar as they are directly connected to the natural law, are unchanging. Okay? Turretin has a section in his Institutes where he's talking about the immutability and indispensability of the precepts, moral precepts of the Decalogue. And one of the reasons he argues that the Ten Commandments as moral law cannot change is because they're the same as natural law. For God to change, do not murder to murder would be for God to change natural law, which would require a whole different philosophical system, which would require us to abandon the way that we've talked about all this. And so he says, no, you can't do that, otherwise you lose what man is, and you lose an ability to know God, and you end up in all these weird absurdities, like touching, eating swine is equivalent to murdering someone, because it's just these positive commands of God. Everything's positive. Okay? So you have the moral law, you have the judicial law, which God gave to the people of Israel to govern them in a particular time, in a particular place, for a particular season. That was good and wise for that particular people, in that particular place, in that particular time. That doesn't mean that it's good and wise for us to be governed by those same exact laws today. Why? Because they were for that people, that place, at that time. Now, when we look at the judicial law, what we see is something very similar to the human law. What do we see? We see particularization fitting to that time and that culture that reflects the natural law. So why is it you put a fence around your rooftop? We don't have those laws today, right? But that law was a particular way in which you protected people and preserved life in the nation of Israel, so that people didn't get up on the roof to cool down at night, something accidentally happened, someone falls over. Okay? I don't need the Bible, the canon, to discern whether or not a particular human society should be able to develop laws that protect and preserve life. All that is a particular determination of natural law in a human society. So judicial law is analogous to human law, those principles of natural law given to a people to govern them well, to protect, preserve, and promote their well-being. Then you have the ceremonial law, right? So the judicial law, what does it do? It expires with the Mosaic economy, right? The ceremonial law, what's that do? Points forward and leads to Christ. Insofar as Christ is the fulfillment of all those things, which he is, those things become deadly to return to, right? So there was a time when they were dying, around the time of the coming of Christ, the death, burial, resurrection, ascension of Christ, where these things are dying out. There becomes a particular time, probably something like 80, 70, when these things are dead and you can't return back to them, right? And then they become deadly practices for us to return to today. This is why we don't engage in some of those same ceremonial laws that God gave to the people of Israel back then. Why? Because then we're returning to the shadow, ignoring the substance, right? And we don't recognize that some things in divine law can change. And that's okay. Not all things, not the moral law, because it's the same in content as the natural law, but there are some things that change. And you see that with judicial law, and you see that with ceremonial law as well. Okay? So, and then you see God gives new laws to his church: baptism, Lord's Supper, new rites that the church is to observe. That so Abraham didn't need to be baptized, but he had to be circumcised. Our males don't have to be circumcised, but if they're going to join the Church of Jesus Christ, they have to be baptized, right? So you have to then take all these laws and try to say, okay, what's gone away, what's expired, what was circumcision pointing to? It was pointing to regeneration. What is baptism pointing to? What are these things signifying? These things can change in appropriate times and seasons. And God has a right to do that because he is the lawgiver. But the natural law can't change because it's a reflection of God's eternal and holy character in those things which he has made. Okay? So that is a brief survey of eternal, natural, human, divine law, where we get our oughts from, why we don't get them from here. Are there any questions? I can be done.
Well, before you're done.
This will be question. I have nothing left to say for right now. So, if you have questions about what I've talked about or anything earlier, this is a great time for them.
It might be helpful at this point, even how you just put in the three forms of the law.
Yeah.
Positive.
You talk about positive law? Yeah. So, no, this is perfect. This is the philosophical basis and theological basis for us to make a distinction between natural law or moral law and positive law. There has to at least be on this scheme a bipartite division between that which is natural or moral and that which is positive. Okay? If you don't have this operating,
Are natural and moral one thing, or is it three things?
Natural and moral are the same in substance, different in how they're given. So, natural law and moral law teach you not to murder, not to steal, okay, to worship the true God. Debates about who that is and how we should do that considered. They all say the same. They all teach the same exact content. The moral law with greater clarity. The moral law given on account of our weakness of intellect. We were having a conversation in the car about this last night, right? If you can, I don't believe in time travel. But if you can get back in time and you can go and you're in Germany in the early 1900s and you're standing over a crib and you say to someone, maybe probably 1800s, no one was born. You say to the two parents, who's this? And they say, oh, this is baby Adolf Hitler. Oh, okay. Well, can I just is that allowed? It's not allowed. And God's command, do not murder, kind of serves to make sure, hey, straighten up. In case you've forgotten and you start to think, if I could kill Hitler now and I could prevent... That ringing in your mind to correct any type of faulty reasoning you may have. True reasoning should lead you to not kill Adolf Hitler. Right reasoning will teach you not to kill Adolf Hitler. But sometimes we get a little carried away. And God's law serves as that reminder of, hey, yeah, that would be murder. Why? Because the murder is the unjust taking of human life. At that point, what is Hitler? He's innocent. He hasn't committed crimes yet. So he can't be murdered. But all that to say, back to your question, moral and natural, same in content, different in the way that they're given. One is a principle of action, one is given to us in a word revelation.
So now return back to
that distinction. Yeah. So this, the way I've laid it out, I've written something that argues that this type of reasoning is necessary in order for us to look at something like the judicial law, the ceremonial law, and the moral law, and not just say that these are all really equivalent. Because you have some people who will say things like, it's all moral. If you weren't circumcised, you disobeyed God. That's immoral, right? But is the command not to murder really the same as circumcise? And usually people who are going to say no, if they're going to try to then make further distinctions, what are they going to appeal to? creation, or canon. Why? Because we see over the development of the history of redemption, as we begin in the garden and we work through and we see how these things are fulfilled in Christ, we see that circumcision goes away with the Mosaic economy, but we don't see that murder goes away. Well, shouldn't we just be able to look at what the thing is and say, like, I shouldn't kill that thing? Right? Am I making sense? So, Steve Wellum is a friend of mine. Good guy. But those are the moves that he makes. This is a personal conversation I had with him, and then some of his own writings, progressive covenantalism, where he talks about doing ethics this way. Andrew Walker, I emailed, he and I have exchanged some emails. I don't know him personally, but he's written a book called Faithful Reason on Natural Law, where he wants to kind of say the things that I'm saying here. At least I think he does. But in order to really understand natural law, you have to have this kind of Aristotelic view of natural law. And so, well, then that's not natural, because remember, when we think Christ, we think Jesus. When we think Jesus, we think redemption, right? And so, when you start having these ideas, it becomes very hard for you to actually separate out and distinguish something like murder and something like circumcision. And so you just have to end up saying, well, as we read the whole of the Bible, we just see that murder doesn't ever get taken away. There's a book called The Widening of God's Mercy by Richard and Stephen Hayes. They argue that throughout the history of redemption, you see an ever widening of God's mercy to be inclusive. And that's the principle that you should abide by. As we continue to do our ethics, we see that God is always in the history of redemption including more people. So what do you think that means today? Where do you think he ends up? Huh? He ends up taking it into the LGBT, all the LGBTQ stuff, right? And so the principle is God's mercy is ever widening, and there's always including. And so who are so God, you go from the eunuch who can't participate to the eunuch who's received. You go from the homosexual who couldn't participate to the homosexual who's now received. Why? You take the marginalized and you bring them in. That's the operating principle of the widening of God's mercy. Well, if you don't have something like this, it is hard to see, is there a trajectory and are things stable, right? Because some things do change and some things don't. And God has given us these things as like a test for the way we read the scriptures as we put together continuity and discontinuity. So, some things that are going to be moral law and natural law are going to be direct reflections of the character of God, that he could not will otherwise than he in fact willed. Positive law comes from God's right and authority to will things that in and of themselves are indifferent. They're not. Circumcision is not contrary to nature, right? Baptism is not contrary to nature. Okay, so God can will these things to signify some reality, particularly usually tied to covenants, so we can identify who his people are. And these things can come and these things can go away. But loving life is something that will never fade away. Why? Because it's who God is. Circumcision is not who God is. Life is who God is. Therefore, everything God makes has to love life. Is that helpful? More positive.
What is positive law?
Yeah, so positive law is something that God has posited, given to us, that concerns something indifferent, that is not in and of itself moral or immoral, that he takes and uses and makes it as a sign that's communicating spiritual reality. So circumcision, baptism, Lord's Supper, these are all instances of those kinds of things.
It's always directed from God.
It comes from God, and we ground it simply in God's authority, not in God's character. God has the authority to give positive law because of who he is. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
First of all, it's not your last name, so I apologize.
You're fine.
But what is the on-paper explanation, justification for things which would certainly fall under being naturally good that we don't necessarily enforce through human law. For example, adoption. Adoption is good, but like we haven't adopted any children, and this is not, this is not like a church discipline issue. It's not
Right.
seen as
Yeah.
the moral thing.
Right. Yeah. Because not adopting is not contrary to nature. So I can't require it of you. But the fact that you've chosen not to, if someone came to me pastorally and said, we want to get married, but we refuse to have children, my answer is I'm not going to marry you. Why? Because that's contrary to the ends and purposes of this particular union. Now, are there people who get married and cannot have children? Yes. Historically, we've distinguished between impotency and barrenness. Impotency is someone who is unable to enter into the one flesh union by virtue of some type of physical defect. So they would be what Jesus described as a eunuch who's either born as a eunuch or a eunuch who was made that way. Barrenness is someone who seems to be able to have and receive children. Everything functions properly, but the effect doesn't always get brought about. Even though things are ordered to that effect, it doesn't get brought about. Okay? So, if someone comes to me and says, I'm not going to, this is my personal answer, I've not had a conversation with Pastor David about this, this is just me. Someone comes to me and says, I want to get married, but I refuse to have kids. I would say, this is not the union for you, because this union is ordered towards procreation. This is the only place where that's supposed to happen, and the act that you come together in as husband and wife is that which is supposed to lead to that. Okay? But that does not mean then that you have an obligation to adopt. It may be something that is pleasing, and it may be something that is good, but it's not something that's completion of who you are and what your marriage union is ordered to. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So the marriage is not complete without the desire to have kids?
I don't know that I would say it's not complete. I would say an intentional rejection of the ends of marriage is the problem there. Does that make sense? Yep. And so it's refusing to, like, so our confession talks about some of the uses of marriage, right? Or some of the ends of marriage. And one of them being to restrain ungodly lusts, right? Bridle ungodly passions, right? This is a strong desire and urge in humanity, and so it needs to be channeled appropriately at the right times in the right places, lest it's like a fountain that's flowing everywhere across the streets that can't be gathered up and gathered in. But to intentionally reject the ends of this particular union is where the problem is.
So, when I received the command that I am not to murder someone, as a Christian man, I have my own New Testament.
Yep.
Am I receiving that because it's natural law directly, or am I receiving it because a certain portion of the Mosaic set of laws is still that in effect? But even though we read the in Hebrews that it's obsolete,
right?
And and Paul's notorious for using the law in a lot of different ways, but he says, "I am no longer under the law; I'm under the law of Christ."
Right.
1 Corinthians 9 and
right.
other places. So, am I receiving it directly, or am I receiving it from the actual, still in force Mosaic economy?
Yeah. So the Mosaic economy, as every covenant does, takes up and picks up with it and brings into the covenant all those moral truths. So, which are natural. So Adam in the garden, hey, can't kill Eve, can't commit adultery, can't steal, although that was a little more difficult because everything was his. Stealing is interesting in that way. So you can't kill your wife. Stick with that one because that one's the easiest for now. You can't commit adultery against God, right? And so turning away from God, that would say you committed adultery against God. It gets brought up, and so if he had eaten of the tree or murdered Eve, he'd have been a violator of the covenant. Yep. And so then when Adam breaks that covenant, right, the positive law and the tree that's with that, that's no longer a way of life. It's blocked off for us, right? So that covenant with Adam, though the moral law still remains the exact same. So when you come then to the Noahic covenant, it's not going to transform or change anything. It's going to bring with it the same moral law that was brought into Adam's covenant. Then you get to the Mosaic covenant, same exact thing is picked up and brought into it. And so we do not receive the Decalogue as Mosaic covenant when we receive it. We receive the moral law that's given in the Decalogue because it's the moral law that is trans-covenantal, that's picked up in the particular covenant, and it's trans-covenantal because it's natural, because God couldn't create a world other than that contradicted the Decalogue, because that would contradict its very nature.
So what about now in the new covenant? What's my situation in regard to the Ten Commandments, even as stated in Exodus and Deuteronomy?
Yeah.
What's my relationship to them versus simply saying, I'm trying to understand I'm under the law of Christ.
Yeah.
Paul's language.
Yeah.
How do I understand that now I'm in the new covenant? Am I looking at the natural law as now still part of that moral?
Yeah, the natural law has the same exact force for you that it has for Adam.
And how am I to view what Moses?
Yeah, so the moral law is summarily comprehended, our catechism says, in the Ten Commandments. And so because these things are not unique to any covenant, you can just take them and say, yep, these are things that I'm not supposed to, these are things that I cannot do, or these are things that I have to do. Why? Because these aren't unique to the Mosaic covenant. They're pulled into the Mosaic covenant, but they're true for any human who's ever lived, regardless of covenant. In fact, apart from covenant. If there was no covenant, you know what else it's true for? It's true for the angels. That's why, what is Satan? He's a murderer from the beginning. He violated the law of God before it was given on Sinai. He violated the law that was written on his essence as an angel.
So if I murder someone, I wouldn't murder my wife.
Me neither.
I'm glad you said that after last night. But if I murder, then I'm not really violating what came out of Sinai per se. That was an expression of a more fundamental natural law that I'm still under as being under the law of Christ, to use Paul's language. Yeah.
And these things that God gave at Sinai are unchanging. Like what? So they're set aside as a law that's written by God's own finger, right? Why? Because they're things that transcend any. So I can look to the Ten Commandments and say, God said, don't murder.
Right.
I don't have to do a lot of exegetical work. I don't have to be like, well, that was in the Mosaic economy, and when he said this, he da-da-da-da. No, why? Well, because the thing he said there is just true for any human. It's true for anything because of who God is. Yeah, and so I can look to the Mosaic covenant, I can pull it over, but I'm not under the Mosaic covenant as a covenant. I'm under the laws that are given in the Mosaic covenant insofar as they are trans-covenantal. Yeah, so, you have commands to love your neighbor in Leviticus. Well, there's a lot of things in Leviticus I don't do. That one I still have to do. In fact, that's why the New Testament authors can proof text. They can just drop in, pull a text, get out, and say, yeah, give love your neighbor.
Yeah, this might be a good time to bring up what you said last night, which tracks right along with our Puritan heritage as well. Getting the time to ask you, is last night you put it this way, the laws comes in Adam versus Christ.
Yeah.
Or the Puritans would say the law as it is in the hand of Moses as opposed to the law as it is in the hands of Christ.
Yeah.
That the relationship that Christians have to the law now is still binding on us.
Yes.
But at the same time, we're not under the law in a certain very important sense.
We're not under this law as a curse. We're not under this law as a Mosaic covenant. We're not. So there's various ways in which we are not under the law, and yet we still have to obey the moral law as law, regardless of what covenant we're in.